Thank you very much indeed, and I'm very pleased to return to the Patrick McGill Summer School, and especially to take part in this discussion on the Constitutional Convention. Now, Maura Thornhill made it clear to me that I should stress to people that the sunburn on the face was a West Cork tan on Saturday, which was just a very rare occasion in this summer of clouds and rain and so on, that I got caught out for 4 hours having a swim in the Atlantic last Saturday morning. And I was intrigued by the opening remarks about schools and so on. I did not have the same school life that Donegal had. I had a very innovative life in Skullcrease Street and Turner's Cross, when a very far-seeing teacher introduced us to politics in a very different way. He divided the class up into different parliaments. He left the room and left us have it out. And we got a very early, crude introduction to politics and how it works. And I would say in my own life, it was the role of certain teachers who instilled in me an interest in current affairs, an interest in public life, and stood me in good stead, despite the absence of any CSPE curriculum and so forth. I'm not going to mention the letter we got, Dan, just before the summer break. That's going to break up the fifth-year students in the primary school that the young fellow is going to at the moment. It could be a cultural issue there as well. But just to say that 75 years ago, as has been said, the Bunreacht na hÉireann was passed by a slim margin of 158,000 votes and 160 onto that. But in my view, that was an auspicious and inspired decision at that time. And it's important, I think, to begin with the simple statement that Bunreacht na hÉireann has served this country well. Eamon de Valera, who was the Constitution's primary author, ably supported by a team of first-class civil servants, including Maurice Moynihan, Michael McDunphy, John Hearn and Stephen Roach, did an extraordinary job in producing a progressive document that espouses liberty, democracy and human rights. And de Valera's achievement in producing a political community's common charter steeped in democratic ethos was all the more remarkable given the European political backdrop against which the Irish Constitution was drafted. By the time Dáil Éireann debated the draft constitution in May 1937, 10 European nations were already under the control of dictators. Constitutional government as a political system was under siege. I believe de Valera has often got a raw deal from some historians, but in regard to the Constitution, and especially in the context of its time, I think it should be widely acknowledged that de Valera showed immense political acumen, courage and foresight in placing before the Irish people a profoundly democratic and republican charter to order our national affairs. And at a time when much of the world was falling to extreme ideologies, Bunreacht na hÉireann actually strengthened democracy and fundamental rights here. For example, no other nation in the world in the 1930s adopted by referendum explicit constitutional protections for the Jewish community. The Constitution also gave us a strengthened judiciary, which has used its independence to be a check on the power of the executive far beyond the situation in other common law countries. And Bunreacht na hÉireann has been an evolving document in many areas, successfully being used as a basis for asserting many progressive rights not considered in 1937. It is, in my view, fundamentally wrong to attack the Constitution in terms of its failure to reflect today's morality and norms while ignoring when it was adopted. Many of the Constitution's biggest failings are not the failings of its drafters, but of the generations who have come since and who have failed to update and modernise it. Today, the first thing we should do when establishing a body to review aspects of the Constitution is to recognise the many enduring strengths of Bunreacht na hÉireann, which are essential to the maintenance of our strong democratic traditions. The job of the Constitutional Convention must be to ensure Bunreacht na hÉireann is fit for purpose for the 21st century. The first and most urgent issue, obviously, in our country continues to be the challenge of fixing our economy and creating employment. But everyone in politics is also acutely conscious that at the last general election, the people sent a very clear message that they want us to reform the way this country is governed. And as a political class, we have to be cognizant of that message. And we also need to be under no illusion that political reform is inextricably linked to the fortunes of economic renewal. Reform is not an optional extra in the process of building a lasting recovery. It is an essential part of the agenda. If we are serious about renewing our economy, I believe meaningful political reform has to be at the top of the Constitutional Convention's agenda. And by meaningful reform, I would contend that there are much more pressing issues to be addressed than lowering the voting age or slicing 2 years off the President's term. In supporting the Constitutional Convention, I would like the government to show some badly needed conviction and not just tinker around the edges. Fianna Fáil believes that in the first instance, the Constitutional Convention should immediately begin to deal with the more substantive and pressing issues of political reform, such as transparent and real Oireachtas reform, an overhaul of the electoral system, and proposals to bring people outside the political system into government at the highest levels. We will continue to push the government to ensure that these substantive issues are brought to the forefront of the work of the Constitutional Convention, because these reforms are crucial to our country's welfare and will mean better politics. And better politics is important to everyone in our society, because this ultimately will mean a stronger economy and stronger society. For the Constitutional Convention not to promptly proceed with discussing issues of substantive reform is, in my view, a missed opportunity. There is simply no doubt that the Irish political system failed in recent years. And our political system, as set out in the most part in the Constitution, is in need of radical and urgent reform. That is a fundamental lesson of the economic crisis which has afflicted the nation. And it's one, I think, that informs, the crisis itself informs the need for a fundamental change in our political architecture. No part of the system predicted what happened, and most parts of the system actively pushed policies which exacerbated the crisis. Government, its agencies and regulators were not subject to enough parliamentary scrutiny and did not draw on a diverse enough range of expertise. As for the Oireachtas, in the decade before the crisis, it did not focus enough on economic fundamentals and did not debate, for example, the financial regulatory system until it was close to collapse. Proposals to lower the voting age to 17 on their own will do nothing to restore economic growth. But reforms that would allow non-parliamentarians with specific expertise to serve in the Cabinet would, I believe, impact favourably on our national efforts towards economic regeneration. So for those reasons, I am somewhat underwhelmed and concerned by the agenda the government has to date set for the Constitutional Convention. And I believe that apart from the composition of the Convention, which does fall far short of the Citizens' Assembly model, I think the Convention has been disappointingly limited in the scope of its review. And I think other speakers have outlined the 7 to 8 areas that are on consideration, so I'm not going to list all those again. But I think of those 7 areas, the only ones which represent an area where radical political reform could be possible is in regard to proposals concerning the Dáil electoral system. And I welcome its inclusion, but I would want to prioritise it at number 1 in terms of consideration, and also the issue of promoting female participation in politics. Fianna Fáil believes that the Irish political system requires a much more fundamental overhaul, however, to ensure that it's fit for purpose in a modern society than the 7 areas which the government has given priority to in the Constitutional Convention. And given that the government seems determined to proceed along these lines, I will outline Fianna Fáil's position on those 7 areas later on in the debate, as well as detailing the fundamental issues of reform that we believe the Convention needs to deal with without further delay. I think it's important, however, that people understand that there's a real danger of the Convention becoming a damp squib, and I think that reflects a lack of conviction on behalf of the government towards the whole agenda of meaningful and deep political reform. There was a lot of commitments made before the election, and the reality is not matching up to the rhetoric we heard in advance, and I think that's a serious issue in itself. And just to say, over the last 15 months, so-called reform programme within the Oireachtas is actually making things worse. There is no improvement in terms of the relationship between the Executive and the Parliament. The Executive still dominates the Parliament. Committees are now more unwieldy, and the government exercises stronger control than ever before. And if you look at what's happening to the Public Accounts Committee, which has enjoyed cross-party support for well over a decade or two now, and has been the one committee that has emerged as a parliamentary committee with some teeth and some capacity. You know, the decision of the Minister for the Environment, for example, when he wrote to them recently, effectively standing down the inquiry into Dublin's Docklands Authority's purchase of the Irish gas bottle site, is very worrying and represents a significant undermining of that committee's work. And I think John McGuinness will be here later in the week and expound even more on that. And you add to that a determined effort essentially to undermine the Public Accounts Committee's role in investigating the collapse in the banking system, and it seems to us that a worrying trend is emerging where that one strong committee is even being undermined as we speak. And the programme for government did promise a radical extension of the parliamentary question system, yet in the Dáil, the Taoiseach now has halved the number of times he attends the House for Taoiseach's questions, and it's now taking up to 3 months for some questions to actually be answered in the Dáil in relation to that particular issue. We haven't had a Constitution Day as such. The timeline in relation to the Convention is obviously slipped, but that can happen. But equally so, I think the Constitutional Convention that has emerged is kind of a square peg and round hole amalgam of some of the constitutional reform pledges in the respective Fine Gael and Labour Party manifestos. And again, that has been dealt with, I think, by Donegal in terms of the marrying of citizens with Oireachtas members. The one point I would make, though, in terms of the slippage and the timeline and the prioritisation, that there's a strong probability now that there won't be substantive constitutional reform or political reform in the lifetime of this Dáil. And I think that's very regrettable and an indictment, really, of the approach to the reform at this stage. Equally incredible is the extraordinary move in which the government is refusing to let a convention on the constitutional future of this country even discuss whether we have a second chamber in Parliament. I find that extraordinary, that if we're looking at the electoral system, if people accept we need a fundamental reform of our political system, why you actually deliberately exclude the Senate from the consideration of the Convention is beyond me, particularly when the Taoiseach himself admitted last week that it's unlikely to get around to a referendum on the Seanad at the earliest by the latter part of 2013. It could be said that the government's approach constitutes a novel twist on the Augustinian maxim and might be described as giving me real reform, but not just yet, or in fact any time soon. I think I'll deal with the 7 issues later in the debate. We believe many of them, blasphemy, presidential term and so on, don't need substantive treatment in relation to the more fundamental issues that we have to actually deal with. I want just to put forward some of the ideas that we have looked at. We will be very open in terms of the electoral system. We believe in a combination of maintaining a strong connection to local politics, but also a national list system with a single seat system which we put forward at the election. We believe that's worthy of consideration. There are other models that we're equally open to as well. And we support the role of changing the role of women and the wording and the amendment of that particular article. And again, good work was done by the Constitutional Review Group in relation to that. We believe marriage equality shouldn't be in the Convention. It's something that's outside the domain of political reform and is a matter for citizens to decide upon. It's something we believe should happen. In terms of Oireachtas committees, we believe that Oireachtas committees need to be streamlined and strengthened, and we believe key Oireachtas committees should be given constitutional standing, which I think would be very important in rebalancing the 3 pillars and the separation of powers. We want to see a strong Oireachtas committee charged with the responsibility of holding regulators to account. In order to uphold Parliament's rights over the influence of government, we also believe the election of the Ceann Comhairle should take place by secret ballot. In France, a radical reform in 2008 means now, for example, that the opposition controls the scheduling of Parliament for a third of the sitting days which handle legislation. That's something that the Constitutional Convention could examine with a view to application here. We believe that we need a Parliament which has a direct link with citizens but is focused on national issues. And we need a government which draws on the best expertise and has a diverse range of talent as is possible in the country. And those are the issues that should be at the forefront of the Constitutional Convention's work, particularly an examination of reform procedures for choosing and operating both Parliament and government. As things stand, and Dan referred to this, almost 20% of members of the Dáil cease active involvement in most work of the Dáil because of their appointment to government. In our current political culture, we are also unusual, as Dan has said, in limiting who can serve in government. We have proposed that members of the Cabinet should not simultaneously serve as members of the Oireachtas, and that persons who are not members of the Oireachtas should be allowed to serve as ministers. We believe it makes sense to bring people outside the system into government at the highest levels, up to and including the Cabinet table. And this would broaden the options open to a future Taoiseach in formulating his or her Cabinet. Other nations use this system to draw on the best and most talented in their ranks to run government departments, and so should a modern Ireland. Politics in this country has been a closed shop for too long, and the economic crisis we're experiencing should be the #1 exhibit in the case for opening it up. And at a time like this, when the people of the country have had to endure the worst recession in modern times, we must draw on every talent we have to get Ireland back to work and back on track. And our proposal specifically says that members of the Cabinet should not be members of the Oireachtas while they serve as ministers. We think it would be a worthwhile exercise for the Constitutional Convention to examine this reform, which would mean when members of the Oireachtas were appointed to Cabinet, they would be replaced by an alternate while serving as a minister. And there's various options in terms of how we'd work such a system. We believe the system would allow ministers to devote significantly more time to their ministerial duties, increase the number of Dáil members participating in all parliamentary duties, and it would in addition significantly increase the accountability of ministers to the Dáil. Our proposal to allow persons who are not members of the Oireachtas to be appointed to serve as ministers is equally radical and rooted in common sense. And I think Dan has gone through a confirmation process and so on, which I think can be put in place. In terms of Seanad reform, again I have articulated our view that it's wrong that the government should not include that within the remit of the Constitutional Convention. I think it's a misguided approach, and I think dealing with the Seanad in isolation will only tighten the grip that the executive has over a parliament. It has to be worked in concert and in tandem with the Dáil and with the executive. And we believe, at the election we said unless there was radical reform across the system, we wouldn't support the abolition of the Seanad unless there was that radical reform. It's not happening, and I believe that the Convention gives a wonderful opportunity now to explore all options in relation to Dáil and the Seanad. And I think we've put forward and will be putting forward a reform programme in relation to the Seanad. At its core will be direct elections, that the citizens would elect people to the Seanad. The Seanad would have specific functions and so forth, and would be a significant check on the executive as well. Of course, the Seanad will require many and a very substantive amendment procedure. The Seanad is mentioned in the Constitution over 60 times, and that shows how significant a measure it is. Just one final observation in regard to the 1930s is that when De Valera included specific constitutional provisions dealing with entitlement to education, that at the time was viewed as innovatory, and there was quite a considerable debate around that issue, the state versus the role of the family in the provision of education. Today, no one views the right to free primary education as set out in Article 42(4) as anything out of the ordinary. But in the context of the 1930s, this was seen by many as constitutionally radical. In our time, I would like us to take a similar approach. And I will leave you with this thought that I believe that the Constitutional Convention should discuss the desirability of incorporating a constitutional provision conferring right of access to health to the children of the nation, similar to the provision in relation to primary education. As we approach the centenary of the Easter Rising, inserting such a provision in our Constitution would give effect to the Proclamation's pledge to cherish all the children of the nation equally in a new and progressive manner. Thank you very much indeed.